Next up in the book, we'll be talking about cycling through techniques that are to be combined with the indirect and deferred methods of entering into the phase, aka a lucid dream, astral projection, or OBE. If you want a more detailed explanation about what the indirect method is and the deferred method is, check my previous posts. I've been talking about it a bunch in the recent videos. However, just a really fast recap of it is it's basically a specific form of wake back to bed, sleep about 6 hours, wake up with an alarm, stay awake a little while, go back to sleep. Then you utilize the natural awakenings that happen from that point on to cycle through a bunch of these techniques that we'll be covering in the subsequent videos. But anyway, he writes, if separation doesn't work out, which would become apparent after 3 to 5 seconds, start right then and there to alternate between 2 to 3 of the following techniques that are the most straightforward to you until one of them works. When this happens, you can try to separate again. All right, so the first one we're going to be going over is the one that I make use of by far the most, and it has to do with observing images, aka hypnagogia, and or maybe even hypnopompia if you happen to realize you're waking up as you see the dream breaks down into hypnopompia, wake up briefly, fall back asleep, you pass through hypnagogia, then hopefully right back into REM. But what he writes in here, man, it is so spot on. And I think this is why this is really like one of the most requested books I've ever had to cover on the channel, because this is basically describing something that I stumbled into an accident in my own personal practice. Don't really see it talked about too much in other places. And so I think that when people would hear me talk about it, like, hey, that sounds just like this book. You know, you got to read the book, or did you get it from the book? When I just actually stumbled into it on accident. But nonetheless, he writes, immediately after waking from sleep, remain motionless, eyes closed. Again, that's a very important part of all of this. Observe the blank space before the eyes for 3 to 5 seconds and try to locate recognizable pictures, images, or symbols. If nothing appears during this exercise, the technique should be substituted. If something appears, continue to passively observe the images. Meanwhile, the images will become increasingly realistic, literally enveloping the practitioner. Do not aggressively examine the details of the image or it will vanish or change. Very true. The image should be experienced as a panorama, taking everything in. Again, very true. That's another kind of approach I like to do when I'm doing open eye meditations, you know, staring at the wall or something like that. Observe the image as long as the quality and realism increases. Doing so yields 2 possible results. The practitioner becomes part of the surrounding and has achieved the phase, or the image becomes borderline or absolutely realistic, and separation from the physical stencil body is possible. Training. To train the use of this technique, lie down in the dark room, eyes closed, and observe the blackness for several minutes, identifying any specific images that may arise from simple spots or floaters, and then gradually transition to whole pictures, scenes, and scenarios. With practice, this technique is very easy and straightforward. Agreed, man. That's one I just fell into and works perfectly for me. A common mistake made during practice of this technique is when the practitioner aggressively attempts to conjure images versus passively observing what is naturally presented. And now one thing I'll say there is that for me at least, I can start to kind of feed ideas into my head and influence these images to pop up, you know, a specific type of liminal dream hypnagogic experience that I want. But nonetheless, and then just to kind of highlight how he says basically the same stuff, but a little different ways in different parts of the chapter, I'll read this other part here from an earlier part of the book. Observing images. Peer into the void behind your closed eyes for 3 to 5 seconds. If nothing occurs, switch to another technique. If you see any kind of imagery, peer into it until it becomes realistic. So once it is, separate from the stencil body right then and there and allow yourself to be pulled into the imagery, which is typically what happens for me when I'm doing this technique. When peering at imagery, it's important not to scrutinize detail lest the image wash away. You'll need to look through the picture, which will make it more realistic. So I always thought about it when you try to look at it too hard with your, scrutinize a picture too much. I feel like I engage my real physical eyes. I start moving around and actually looking and trying to zero in on it, which causes you to wake up too much, and then it blacks everything out. So that's been my experience with, looking too closely at the images. Basically with like my real eyes, you want to watch it with your mind's eye. Anyway, that'll wrap up the first technique. And until the next video, keep your phase practice legit.